The rain had that heavy, metallic sound, the kind that hits old tin roofs like distant gunfire. I stood in front of the house I'd once called home, the same one my father built with his own hands 40 years ago, and for a long moment, I just listened to it breathe through the cracks. The wooden panels were warped now, the porch light flickered like it was gasping for life. I remembered every inch of this place. The creak of the third step, the smell of sawdust and cigarette smoke that used to fill the air whenever he worked late in the garage. My truck engine ticked behind me, cooling in the rain. Inside, I could hear the faint hammering of nails, slow, deliberate, the rhythm of a man too old to hurry anymore. My father was still fixing things, or maybe just pretending to. He always believed a man was only worth the noise he made when he worked. I never forgot that. I never forgot any of it. I was holding a set of keys in my right hand, heavier than they should have been. My fingers curled tight around them like I was holding on to the past itself. The porch light caught the silver metal, and for a second I saw my reflection. Older, sharper, calmer. A man I knew he wouldn't recognize. I wasn't supposed to come back here. Not after everything he'd said, everything he'd done. But time has a strange way of turning pain into purpose, and tonight wasn't about revenge. It was about closure. I took a slow breath, the kind that scrapes the lungs. Rainwater ran down my collar as I stepped forward, boots thudding against the same wooden floorboards that once echoed under my teenage rage. The smell hit first, old timber, damp walls, and faint traces of the cologne he used to wear. Cheap stuff, Mom used to say, but it makes him feel like a man. Feel like... He was in the living room when I saw him, hunched over, hammer in hand, glasses sliding down his nose. His hair had turned to snow, but the lines of stubbornness on his face hadn't softened. He looked smaller now, like the world had slowly taken pieces of him and never gave them back. He didn't notice me right away. The hammer struck the nail again, 1, 2, 3 times, until I finally said, "You missed a spot." He froze. The hammer slipped from his hand, landing on the floor with a dull thud. Slowly, he turned. For a second, I saw confusion flicker across his face, the kind you get when you see a ghost in the daylight. Then came recognition, then silence. He didn't speak. Neither did I. The years hung between us like fog, thick, suffocating, full of things we'd both left unsaid. "You shouldn't be here," he finally muttered, his voice rough like gravel. "I know," I said, "but I needed to see you." He looked at me the way a man studies something he doesn't trust, eyes narrowing, jaw tightening. "What for? You already made it clear you're better off without this place." I could have told him 100 things. I could have said how wrong he'd been about me, how his words had driven me to the edge more times than I could count. I could have said I'd spent years trying to prove I was more than what he called me. But none of that would have mattered, not tonight. Instead, I held out the keys. He stared at them, confused. "What's that?" "They're for a house," I said. "Yours." He frowned. "What do you mean, mine?" "It's not this one," I said, glancing around the broken walls, the cracked ceiling, the ghosts of every argument that had ever echoed here. "It's the one you used to talk about when I was a kid. The one with the wraparound porch, the lake view. The one you said you'd build if you ever had the money." His eyes flicked to mine, disbelief settling in. "You're joking." "No," I said softly. "I bought it. For you." The silence that followed felt like a lifetime. The hammer was still on the floor between us, the sound of rain filling every empty corner of the room. He didn't move, didn't blink. Then slowly his lower lip trembled. I'd seen my father angry, loud, violent even. But I'd never seen him like this. The weight of years, of pride, regret, and something like shame, bent his shoulders further. His voice cracked when he finally spoke. "You bought me a house?" "Yeah," I said, forcing a small smile. "Guess I became a man after all." He turned away, covering his mouth, but I saw the tears anyway. The man who'd once told me real men don't cry was crying. I didn't say anything. I just stood there watching the storm outside and the one breaking inside him. For the first time in my life, The house felt quiet, not empty, just still. That was the moment I knew this story had to be told, because men like my father, and men like me, we're raised to build walls, not homes, to prove, not to feel. And sometimes the only way to make peace with your past is to face the man who taught you pain and show him what strength really looks like. My name's Ryan Mitchell. I was 20 when my father kicked me out and told me I'd never make it past 30. I was 36 when I handed him the keys to his dream house. But to understand how we got here, how a broken boy became the man his father could finally respect, you need to know how it all started. It began with a belt. I was 9 the first time my father called me useless. It wasn't even a big deal to him. Just a word tossed across the garage when I couldn't lift a plank of wood he was cutting for the fence. He didn't mean it to scar me, I guess. But when you're 9, and the man who built your world tells you you're nothing, it sticks somewhere deep, somewhere permanent. He believed strength was the only language a man needed to speak. Pain was weakness, tears were sin, and softness was something he couldn't stand to see. My mother used to try to smooth the edges between us, but she learned quick that silence was safer. She'd whisper things like, "He loves you, Ryan, he just doesn't know how to say it." But love that hides behind a raised voice, doesn't it sound like love when you a boy? It sounds like thunder. Every evening after dinner, he'd drag me out to the garage. He'd hand me a wrench or a saw, or sometimes just a broom and tell me to make myself useful. I'd try, God, I tried, but everything I did was wrong. The nails weren't straight enough, the paint wasn't even, my hands weren't steady. And every mistake was met with that look, that disappointed glare that said more than any words ever could. When I was 12, I built a small birdhouse for school. I painted it blue, glued every piece carefully, and even carved my initials underneath. I showed it to him, waiting for something, anything, and that sounded like approval. He turned it over in his hands, looked at the crooked roof, and said, "A man who can't measure right will never build anything that lasts." Then he set it down and walked away. That night I stayed awake staring at the ceiling, promising myself I'd build something bigger one day, something he couldn't ignore. Mom died when I was 15. A car accident on Highway 27, middle of a rainstorm. She was the quiet that held our house together, and when she was gone, the silence turned mean. Dad stopped talking altogether for a while, just worked longer hours, came home smelling like oil and whiskey. I'd try to make him dinner sometimes, but he'd just sit there staring through his plate like he didn't see me. I think that when he started seeing me as a ghost, something that reminded him of everything he'd lost and everything he hated in himself. By 17, I couldn't stand that house anymore. He'd tell me things like, "Real men don't dream, they work," or "You'll never be half the man I was." And I believed him for a long time. I worked construction after school, took whatever shifts I could just to stay out of the house. The night I told him I wanted to go to college for architecture, he laughed so hard I thought he'd choke. "You? College?" he said between laughs. "You can't even fix a broken fence. You're not cut out for that world, son. You're soft, just like your mother." That night turned into shouting, then pushing, then me standing in the driveway with a duffel bag and nowhere to go. He didn't stop me, didn't even look back when I slammed the door. The next morning I found $20 tucked into my jacket pocket. No note, just cash. That was the only apology I ever got. I slept on couches, worked night shifts, and barely scraped by enough to apply for community college. When I got in, I thought ID finally proved something. But life has a way of testing you harder when you start to believe. The bills piled up fast. Rent, tuition, books. I was working 3 jobs, barely eating, and still falling short. Some nights I'd walk past construction sites and watch the crews work, just listening to the sound of drills and hammers, pretending that someday I'd be designing the buildings they worked on. I'd pull out a notebook and sketch in the streetlight, my hands shaking from exhaustion but my chest full of quiet fire. I called him once during that time. I don't know why. Maybe I wanted him to know I was trying. Maybe I wanted him to be proud. He picked up after 3 rings, his voice still gruff, like he hadn't aged a day. "It's me," I said. "Ryan." He didn't say anything for a while, then, You still wasting time on that college nonsense? I told him I'd gotten a scholarship offer, that I was doing okay. He snorted. Okay, don't feed a family, you'll learn that soon enough. Then he hung up. I didn't call again for 7 years. The day I graduated, I mailed him the invitation. Not because I thought he'd come, but because part of me needed to believe that deep down he still cared. He never showed. The seat I'd saved for him stayed empty. When I looked out at the crowd, all caps and gowns and cheering families, that empty chair hit harder than any insult he'd ever thrown. But that was the day I made a promise to myself, that I'd build something he could not laugh at, that I'd rise so high even his silence couldn't touch me. I started at the bottom, drafting assistant for a local architecture firm, making coffee runs and tracing blueprints late into the night. I learned, I adapted, I watched. Within 5 years, I designed my first project, a small community center on the east side. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. When it opened, the local paper ran a story. I mailed him a copy. He never replied. Years passed. My name started showing up on bigger projects, apartment complexes, city offices, even a luxury high-rise in downtown Austin. Every design was a piece of that boy who once stood in a garage being told he'd never be a man. Every structure was proof that I'd become something solid, not in spite of him, but because of the cracks he'd left in me. And yet, no matter how far I went, part of me was still chasing his voice, that quiet, cruel test that echoed in my head. You'll never be half the man I was. That voice followed me until the night I got the call that would bring me home again. A call from a neighbor who said, "Ryan, it's your father. He's not doing too well." The drive back to my hometown felt longer than it should have. Maybe because every mile peeled back layers of memories I'd buried under work and success. The old highway signs looked smaller, the towns emptier. I hadn't been back in almost 15 years. I'd told myself I was too busy, too focused on my projects, but the truth was simpler. I wasn't ready to face him. I'd built towers and skylines, but the thought of walking into that small, peeling house made my chest tighten like I was 17 again, standing on the porch with a duffel bag and his voice in my ear. "You'll never make it without me." I pulled up to the old house just as the sun was setting, painting the sky in tired orange and gray. The mailbox was rusted, the yard overgrown. The paint on the porch was cracked and fading, like the house itself had stopped trying years ago. Through the window, I saw the flicker of a television, old, box-shaped, sitting on top of a milk crate. He was still living the same way, the same stubborn pride holding everything in place. I sat in the car for a while, engine idling, heart beating slower than usual. When I finally stepped out, gravel crunched under my shoes. The air smelled like pine and smoke. The door creaked when I knocked. A few seconds later, I heard a shuffle, a cough, and then the door opened halfway. He stood there, smaller than I remembered, his shoulders hunched, his gray hair thin, his eyes tired but sharp enough to recognize me instantly. He didn't speak at first, just stared. Then, with a dry laugh, he said, "Well, I'll be damned." The college boy finally came back. His voice hadn't lost its edge, still carried that undertone of challenge like everything was a test. I wanted to be angry, to throw the years in his face, the success, the silence. But seeing him like that, fragile, worn down by time, took something out of me. "Hi, Dad," I said quietly. He grunted and stepped aside, letting me in without another word. The house smelled like dust and old coffee. Nothing had changed. The same stained couch, the same framed photo of Mom on the mantel, her smile frozen in a time when the world still made sense. The only new addition was a small oxygen tank by his recliner and a stack of pill bottles on the table. He sank into the chair, breathing heavier than I wanted to admit, eyes still on me like he was trying to read something in my face. "So," he said after a moment, "they finally kicked you out of the big city?" I almost laughed. "No, Dad. I came because I heard you weren't doing well." "Who told you that? Neighbors gossiping again?" "Does it matter?" I said. "You need help." He waved a hand, dismissive. "I don't need anything from you. Been fine on my own this long." The same pride, same wall. Only now it was protecting a man who didn't have the strength to keep standing behind it. I looked around the room, peeling wallpaper, water stains on the ceiling, a heater that probably hadn't worked in years. "You're living like this?" I asked. He glared. "What's that supposed to mean?" "It means you don't have to. I can help." "I don't need your charity, Ryan." "It's not charity. See me wanting to do something good for you." He laughed again, bitterly this time. "Good for me? Where were you when your mother died? When I lost everything? You left. You ran off to prove a point." His words hit like cold water. "You kicked me out, Dad. You gave me no choice." I took a slow breath. There's always a choice. For a while, neither of us spoke. The television hummed in the background, showing a commercial for some local roofing company. It was strange. I'd built entire cities, but standing in that tiny living room made me feel like a kid again. I sat down on the edge of the couch, running my hand over the worn fabric. "I made something of myself," I said softly. "I know," he replied. That surprised me. "You know?" He nodded. "That neighbor of yours, Mrs. Collins, she keeps a computer. Every once in a while she shows me those articles. Said my boy's designing skyscrapers now. Guess I raised you to be more stubborn than I thought." It was the closest thing to a compliment I'd ever heard from him, but he said it without looking at me. I smiled a little. "Thanks." He shrugged. "Don't thank me. You did it despite me, not because of me." He was right, and that truth hurt in ways success couldn't fix. I wanted to tell him about everything. The nights I went hungry, the projects I almost lost, the times I heard his voice in my head pushing me harder when I wanted to quit. But looking at him now, hunched over and coughing into a tissue, I realized none of that would change what we were. I stayed that night, cooked him dinner, fixed the heater, threw out old food from the fridge. He complained about everything, the salt, the smell, the noise, but he didn't tell me to leave. When he fell asleep in the recliner, I walked outside and looked up at the stars, the same sky I used to stare at when I dreamed about escaping this town. I'd done it. I'd made it. But standing there in the same dirt driveway, I realized success meant nothing if I couldn't make peace with where I came from. The next morning, I called a contractor from my company, told them to send a crew, no questions, no budget limits. I gave them an address and said, "We're rebuilding that house top to bottom." That was the start of something bigger than a renovation. It was a bridge, one I wasn't sure would hold, but one I had to build anyway. The next few days moved like slow thunder. I stayed in town longer than I planned, telling Dad I had some remote work to finish, though what I was really doing was rebuilding his world piece by piece. The crew showed up early one morning, a handful of my most trusted men who worked with me on luxury projects and city renovations. They were confused when I handed them the address of a sagging house on the outskirts of town, but they didn't ask questions. Loyalties like that. You earn it in sawdust and long nights. "Keep it quiet," I told them. "Work during the day while he's at the doctor's or sleeping. I want it done right, but I don't want him to know until it's finished." Felt strange giving orders on the same driveway where I once stood waiting for my father to tell me what to do. The roles had reversed, but the weight in my chest hadn't lightened yet. He'd never take my help willingly. He'd see it as pity. So I disguised it as something else, fixing things just so the place doesn't fall apart, replacing a few bad boards here and there. Every nail driven in was part of a plan I didn't have the courage to say out loud. I worked alongside the crew, hammering, sanding, painting, breathing in the dust of my childhood. The walls came down to their bones, and so did my memories. Every beam had a story. Every crack reminded me of a night I sat awake hearing him curse the world under his breath. But this time the sound of hammers wasn't angry. It was healing. On the third day, Dad hobbled out to the porch, squinting in disbelief as he saw the workers. "What the hell's going on out here?" he barked. I wiped the sweat from my forehead. "Fixing the place up, you said the roof leaks, figured I'd handle it." He frowned. "You could have called a local guy. Don't need all this fancy nonsense." "They're just helping out, Dad. Let me take care of it." He grumbled something about wasting money but didn't argue further. I caught him later that afternoon standing in the doorway, watching us silently as we worked. He didn't say thank you, but he didn't tell us to stop either. Every evening after the crew left, I'd sit with him for dinner. He'd eat quietly, then start talking about random things: the weather, the neighbors, the broken lawnmower he never got around to fixing. But sometimes, between those small silences, the truth slipped through. "You know," he said one night, pushing his food around, "when you left, I told myself I didn't care. Told everyone I was better off without you." I looked up, surprised he'd even mentioned it. "But every night I'd see your light still on in that empty room," he continued. "Didn't realize how quiet the house could get." It wasn't an apology, not quite. But for him, it was close enough to move something in me. We kept at the work for weeks. New walls, fresh wiring, a roof that didn't leak. Slowly, the house transformed, not into something modern or extravagant, but into what it should have always been: a home. I added touches I knew he'd like: wood paneling in the living room, a porch swing like the one Mom always wanted, a small garden where her favorite daisies used to grow. He noticed the details. "You remember that swing?" he asked one morning. "Of course, you built it the summer before she died." He nodded slowly, eyes distant. "She used to sit there for hours, said it was the only place she felt peace." His voice broke just a little on that last word, and I realized I'd never seen my father look small before. Time had taken the fire from him, but it had also given him something. Perspective, maybe, or regret. One night I found him sitting on the porch long after I thought he'd gone to bed. The moonlight hit his face in a way that made him look younger, like the man from my earliest memories, before bitterness hardened him. I sat beside him. We didn't speak for a while. The air smelled like sawdust and pine, and somewhere in the distance a train passed. "I wasn't good at being a father," he said finally. His tone wasn't defensive this time. It was cracked open, raw. "Didn't know how to teach you right without breaking you a little. My old man did worse to me. Guess I thought it was the only way." I didn't know what to say. Every answer that came to mind felt too small for the weight of what he was admitting. He turned to me. "But you turned out better than I ever was." I met his eyes. "You taught me how to survive, even if you didn't mean to," he nodded. "Yeah, maybe that's something." That was the first time he didn't call me weak, the first time I saw his walls start to crack. A week later, the renovation was complete. I told him the crew was done, and that the rest was just touch-up stuff. What he didn't know was that I had one more surprise. The biggest one yet. A new house. His dream home. Not a mansion, not a statement of wealth, but something built in his image. Solid, simple, strong. I'd bought a piece of land just outside town, overlooking the hills where he used to take me fishing as a kid. The paperwork was done, the design complete. All that was left was to show him. That night, as he fell asleep in the recliner, I looked at his rough, calloused hands resting on the armrests. The same hands that once built, punished, and protected. Hands that had shaped my life in ways he'd never understand. I knew what I had to do. Tomorrow I'd take him there. Tomorrow he'd see what his son had built. Not for approval, not for pride, but for peace. Morning sunlight filtered through the window, painting golden lines across the floorboards. I stood by the kitchen counter, 2 mugs of coffee in hand, watching my father shuffle toward the table, his old robe trailing behind him. He looked smaller somehow, like the house had outgrown him. "You're up early," he muttered, rubbing his eyes. "You planning another one of your secret projects today?" "Something like that," I said with a faint smile. "Get dressed, Dad. I want to show you something." "What, more repairs?" he groaned, already suspicious. "Just trust me this time." He gave me a long, wary look, but after a few minutes he disappeared into his room. When he came back, he was wearing the same worn jacket he'd owned since I was 17. The elbows faded, the zipper half broken. We got into my truck and drove out of town in silence. The radio stayed off. The only sound was the hum of the tires and the occasional cough from him. The sky was pale blue. The kind of day that carried no promises, just peace. "Where are we going?" he asked finally. "You'll see." The road curved past the hills where the grass swayed like it was breathing. I pulled into a gravel driveway leading up to a brand new house, modest but beautiful. A wraparound porch, cedar siding, large windows overlooking the valley below. It looked like something out of one of those country magazines Mom used to collect. Dad's brow furrowed. "Whose place is this?" "Yours," I said quietly. He blinked, not understanding. "Mine? Don't start with your jokes." I turned off the engine and looked at him. "No joke. I bought the land last year. Built it for you." He stared through the windshield, his lips pressed tight, the gears in his mind clearly grinding. "You built me a house?" "Yeah," I said softly. "Everything you ever wanted in one place. Workshop out back, your old fishing rod mounted on the wall inside, and—" I hesitated. "A porch swing, just like the one Mom loved." He didn't move at first. Then slowly he opened the door and stepped out, eyes fixed on the house as if he was walking through a dream he didn't trust. He ran a hand along the railing, the polished wood shining in the morning light. "You did this?" "Every inch." He turned to me, squinting hard. "Why?" I took a breath. "Because for a long time I thought I needed your approval to be a man. But now I know being a man isn't about proving someone wrong. It's about doing right, even when nobody says thank you." He swallowed, his throat tightening. "You shouldn't have wasted your money on me." "It's not wasted," I said. "You built me even when you didn't know you were. This is me returning the favor." He tried to speak but couldn't. His jaw flexed, his chest heaved slightly, and then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "You really think I deserve this?" I looked him dead in the eyes. "I don't build for the deserving, Dad. I build for the ones who taught me how to build." He turned away quickly, pretending to inspect the porch column. I caught the slight tremor in his hand. For the first time in my life I saw him cry. Not the loud kind, not the broken kind. Just quiet, uncontrollable tears from a man who'd spent decades refusing to show weakness. I stepped forward, rested a hand on his shoulder, and said, "Welcome home." He nodded, his voice cracking. "I used to think I failed you, Ryan. Guess maybe I didn't ruin everything after all." I smiled. "You didn't ruin anything. You just made the road harder. But sometimes that's how you build strength." We went inside. His eyes moved across every detail. The oak flooring, the framed photo of Mom on the mantel, the workbench in the back room already stocked with tools. He stopped in the living room, staring at a small brass plaque fixed to the wall beside the fireplace. It read, "For the man who taught me how to build, one broken board at a time." He brushed his fingers over the plaque, then sat heavily on the couch, eyes glistening. "You've done well, son," he said finally. "Better than I ever could have imagined." I sat beside him, letting the silence stretch between us. For once, it wasn't heavy. It was calm. Later that day, as we sat on the porch swing overlooking the hills, he said something I'll never forget. "When you were little, I was scared you'd turn out soft, that the world would eat you alive, but looking at you now—" He shook his head with a smile that was half regret, half pride. "You became the kind of man I always wanted to be." The sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in orange and red. The air was quiet except for the creak of the swing. I looked at him and said, "You once told me I'd never be a man, but today I think we both finally became one." He laughed softly, eyes wet again. "Guess we did." That night, as I drove back to the city, I glanced in the mirror and saw him still sitting on that porch, the house glowing behind him. For the first time, he didn't look like the man who broke me. He looked like the man I'd finally forgiven. The next morning I woke up before sunrise and just sat there in my truck outside the house, staring at the porch light still on. He hadn't turned it off. Something told me he didn't sleep much that night. There was a quietness in the air you could feel in your bones. That still kind of silence that only happens when two men, who've spent their whole lives misunderstanding each other, finally run out of words. I walked up the steps, coffee in hand, and found him sitting on the swing again, wrapped in a blanket, watching the fog roll over the valley. "You're early," he said without looking up. "You didn't even go home, did you?" I smiled. "Didn't feel right leaving yet." He nodded slowly. "Good. Feels strange not to wake up to the same leaky roof and cold floorboards." Then after a pause, he added, "It's quiet here, too quiet, makes a man think." I handed him his coffee. "That's the point, isn't it?" He chuckled under his breath. "Maybe." For a long moment, we just sat there, both sipping coffee, both lost in our own thoughts. Then he said something I never expected. "You know, when I said you'd never be a man, I wasn't angry at you. I was angry at myself." I looked at him, but he kept staring straight ahead. "When your mother got sick," he continued, his voice tight, "I didn't know how to handle it. She was everything good in this house, I was just the noise. When she died, I started taking it out on everyone else, especially you. You had her heart, her patience. I couldn't stand seeing it." I felt my throat tighten. I'd spent half my life waiting to hear those words, and now that they'd finally come, I didn't know how to answer. He rubbed his eyes, sniffed, and said, "You didn't deserve the way I talked to you. I thought if I broke you early, the world couldn't break you later. I didn't realize I was just teaching you how to carry pain." I swallowed hard, my chest burning. "I carried it," I said quietly, "but it taught me something too. You can survive anything if you learn to build from the wreckage." He nodded, eyes glistening. "Guess you built something better than I ever did." "No," I said softly. "We built this together, even if it took 30 years. He looked down at the mug in his hands and whispered, "I don't deserve this house, son." "You do," I said, "because no matter how many times you pushed me down, you're the reason I learned how to stand." A tear slid down his cheek, and for the first time in my life, I didn't look away. The man who had once towered over me now seemed small, fragile even, like a photograph that had faded over time. But there was peace in his face now, something I hadn't seen in decades. That afternoon, we went into town together. Everyone who saw us, the same people who watched me leave years ago with nothing but a bag and bruised pride, couldn't hide their surprise. Some of them nodded, some smiled, others just stared. My father didn't say much, but I could tell he felt it too, the weight of 100 unsaid apologies floating between us and the world. We stopped by the hardware store where he used to take me every weekend as a kid. He ran his hand along a display of new hammers and said, "Used to think building things was just about wood and nails. Guess I was wrong. It's about people," I said, "and the things we fix along the way." He smiled faintly. "Maybe you did become more of a man than I ever was." When we got back to the house, the sun was setting again. He stood at the edge of the porch, watching the orange light dance across the valley. "Your mother would have loved this place," he murmured. "I built it for both of you," I said. "Even if she's not here, I wanted her to see what you raised." He nodded, then turned toward me with a kind of quiet pride that words couldn't capture. "You're a good man, Ryan. Don't let anyone, especially me, ever make you think otherwise again." For once, he didn't look like the man who'd told me I wasn't enough. He looked like the father I'd always hoped he'd be. That night, as he went inside, I stayed on the porch swing. The stars came out one by one, and the house behind me felt alive, full of warmth, forgiveness, and the ghosts of every broken word we'd finally buried. I don't know how long I sat there before I realized I was crying. Not from sadness, but from the strange relief of knowing I didn't have to prove anything anymore. My father had spent a lifetime trying to make me tough. In the end, I think I just made him soft. And maybe that was the real victory. 2 years later, the sound of rain against the porch roof woke me before dawn. The air smelled like cedar and wet soil, that familiar countryside perfume that always made me feel grounded. I still lived in the same town, only a few miles from the house I'd built for Dad. But these days, I came back every weekend to check on things. The porch swing creaked when I sat down, just like it always had. And for a moment, I could almost hear him again. His deep voice muttering something about the weather or politics, or how the coffee had gotten weaker since I'd started buying the fancy beans. The truth was, he'd been gone for almost 6 months. A quiet heart attack in his sleep, right there on that swing. I'd found him with a book still open on his lap, one of Mom's old gardening journals. Peaceful, no struggle, no pain, just like he'd always wanted. To go sitting outside, watching the sun rise over the valley he'd never thought he'd live to see again. I'd buried him next to Mom, on the hill behind the old church, the same place he used to take me when I was a kid to teach me about hard work, which usually meant handing me a shovel while he fixed the fence. The day we lowered his casket, the whole town showed up. Men who'd worked with him on construction sites 30 years ago, women from the church choir, even some of the guys who'd once told me my father was impossible to please. Every single one of them had something kind to say. It surprised me how much people remembered the good parts of a man after he is gone, how the rough edges get filed down, leaving only the warmth beneath. After the funeral, I couldn't bring myself to sell the house. I kept it the way it was. His tools still hanging on the wall, his boots by the door, the chair he always sat in facing the window. I didn't need the space, but I needed the reminder. That house wasn't just wood and stone. It was a full circle carved out of pain, pride, and reconciliation. It was proof that two stubborn men could still find peace before it was too late. Sometimes I still play back our last conversation. He'd been sitting in the swing, sipping coffee while I fixed the railing. He said, "You know, I used to think being a man was about how much you could lift, how long you could work, how loud you could yell. Turns out, it's about how much you can forgive." I remember laughing, not realizing those would be the last real words he'd say to me. Now, whenever I stand on that porch and the wind hits just right, I swear I can hear his voice again, not shouting, not criticizing, but calm. Like the echo of a storm finally spent. Last month, I hosted the town's first animal shelter fundraiser in his name, the Jameson Foundation for Stray Animals. The same kind of small-town event he used to tease me about when I said I wanted to build something meaningful. We raised nearly $120,000 that night. As I stood on stage to thank everyone, I glanced up and saw a picture of him projected on the screen behind me, in his old work shirt, grease on his hands, that same hard stare that used to scare me as a kid. But under the spotlight, it looked different, softer, proud. After the event, a kid around 20 came up to me. "Sir," he said shyly, "I just wanted to say your story about your dad really hit me. Mine doesn't talk to me anymore, but hearing what you said, I think I might call him tonight." That one sentence. That's when I realized the cycle really had broken. Later that night, I drove back to the house alone. The sky was clear, the stars sharp and bright. I parked, walked up the path, and sat where Dad used to sit. The wood was cold beneath me, but it felt right, familiar. I whispered, "I did it, Dad. I became the man you wanted me to be, and maybe the son you needed me to be." The wind rustled through the trees, carrying the faint sound of an old swing creaking back and forth. I closed my eyes and smiled. He'd spent years trying to make me hard. And all along, life had been teaching me how to stay human. The day I bought him that house, he cried for the first time in my life. But the night I buried him, I finally understood why. He hadn't been crying because of guilt or pride. He'd been crying because he saw himself in me, not the broken man he used to be, but the one he'd always hoped he could become. They say fathers teach their sons how to live, but sometimes it's the son who teaches the father how to heal. And as I sat there, the valley bathed in moonlight, I whispered, "You were wrong, old man. I did become a man, but not because I proved you wrong, because I learned how to forgive you." The porch creaked again, and for a heartbeat I could almost hear his chuckle, the kind that said everything words never could.